My name is Anthony Luscree, Kilo 8 Zulu Tango. And there we go. Now the screen's shared properly. And I want to talk about ideas for getting youth involved in amateur radio. All the materials today, plus more, I have about 120 slide show that I'm not going to be showing all the slides from today, are available at tiny.cc slash YIAR, Youth in Amateur Radio. Again, tiny.cc slash Youth in Amateur Radio, and I'll give that link a couple times through the presentation. If you look around at a Hamfest or at your local club, you're going to see a lot of gray hair, and I think this may be the case for most clubs in the U.S. and the world. So what we want to talk about today is defining youth in amateur radio and some ideas how to get youth more involved in amateur radio. For the purposes of the presentation today, I'm going to be defining youth as anyone of age under 26 years of age. We're going to divide that into three main groups: students in grades 4 through 8, high school students, and college students and recent graduates. Of course, the approaches and focus will differ for each of the different age groups. For students in 4th through 8th grade, a lot of times it's a matter of exposure, classroom demos, something called Radio Day, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. School clubs can start at this age group. And we stress the integration with school subjects, including STEM and other activities. The big thing is this is sort of like a virtual field trip where the students, instead of going on a field trip, have the ham radio demonstration come to them. It's usually not selected by students, it's everyone in the class. When we start looking at the next age group, high school and then college students, I think what we really need to do a lot more is focus on recruiting individual students who might have an interest in amateur radio. Sometimes this might be through specific majors or classes in which we recruit more heavily. For college level and graduates and students getting ready to graduate, stress the career paths, the networking opportunities, etc., and licensing classes followed by mentoring and opportunities for operating, especially contesting. So let's talk a little bit about the historic pathway for youth to get into amateur radio, and I've defined 4: shortwave listening, scouting programs, school radio clubs, and probably the biggest factor is a family member that's a ham. And we can't do anything about that today, so we'll discuss the other 3 mainly. Shortwave listening, unfortunately, there's been a large decrease in the number of broadcasts done worldwide and in the scope and variety of programs available. The programming is rather limited. If you want to listen to hams on shortwave listening, hams are on single sideband, so unfortunately most commercial shortwave AM receivers have no ability to pick up hams easily. So we'll talk about a way around that. Scouting programs, unfortunately, there's been a large decrease in the number of both troops and the youth entering into scouting programs. School radio clubs are not as common as they were once, and it's not just with radio. Many clubs at schools are in a general decline, with schools having less and less after school clubs of any variety. So let's take a little look at what my personal experience has been as far as getting involved. I got interested in science and geography, especially maps. I was interested in electronics and in radio in junior high. My main source of information were magazines such as the Popular Electronics and Communications World that I would pick up at my local pharmacy or look at in the library. I was very interested in radio, and I convinced my parents to buy me a Christmas gift of a shortwave receiver. It was a kit, the Graymark 551, which I still have downstairs in my basement now. And it got me started on listening to shortwave broadcasts and eventually listening to ham radio also. But there was no license. As a youth, I didn't know another ham, so I had no idea how to study to get my license. I was intimidated by the Morse code requirement, and the cost of new equipment was just prohibitive for a young teenager. So unfortunately, no license at that time. In 1981, about 10 years later, after college and marriage, my wife saw an ad in the local paper for an amateur radio class. We went together to weekly Morse code classes, and I passed the novice test in the summer of 1981, upgraded to tech later that fall, joined the local radio club, and became active in radio. So even though I was interested in my youth, I didn't really get involved until much later than that. Let's go through some myths about amateur radio and youth. One is that you have to have a school club, and that's not really the case. It's helpful. It's a great thing to do, but you can't devote all your time just to developing a club, and it's not the easiest first step. A school club might be an outgrowth of a program that you get involved with, but probably not the first step. Another common myth is that licensing is everything. I'm going to talk a lot more about how licensing is not everything. The whole idea of exposure and getting students interested in amateur radio doesn't need to focus just on licensing. So don't assume if you don't immediately license a bunch of students that your program is a failure. And even though we might think it is hams, everyone given an opportunity doesn't necessarily want to become a ham. And it's not always love at first sight. Sometimes that introduction is not the spark. Sometimes the spark will take effect later in life. And there's this myth that high school is the best age to approach students. It's probably one of the worst times to get in touch with students. It's probably much better to try and get them active before they get into high school and get busy with other things. Some other myths are that you have to have an outside antenna and you must have a radio to be able to listen to amateur radio. And with the advent of software-defined radio tuners online, that's no longer the case, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And there's this idea that kids need simplified content, and that's not the case at all. Sometimes they not familiar with the basics, but once they understand the basics, they have no problem with learning the concepts of radio. And in some cases, I find it easier to teach the math necessary to high school age students than it is to teach to a 60-some-year-old newcomer to amateur radio. There's this myth that voice is the preferred mode for demos and the only way that you can demonstrate radio to kids. It's one way to do it, but it's definitely not the only way. And in some cases, voice may seem sort of boring to kids who are used to using cell phones all the time. There's this myth that contesting isn't for kids. Well, when you look at kids, one of the things that they're very involved in is competition. Things like video games or sports activities they might be involved in after school, or all types of competition. And kids are naturals at getting involved in an interesting competition such as contesting. Some other myths: everything is surface mount now, so no one ever builds anything. We found that the students in our local group were very interested in soldering, and they actually enjoyed assembling small kits. The whole idea of CW is dead. If you've went to the session before this on getting kids involved in CW, you know that's definitely not the case. And then two common fallacies is there's money and grants available, and companies will gladly support your radio club's financial interest. That's not necessarily the case. So don't assume that just because you start something that you're going to immediately get money for equipment. So where do you connect the youth at? Well, there's a couple ways. One is through school organizations, schools, and then other organizations such as scouting, youth groups, community organizations. Those are some of the areas in which you can find students. And then there's some direct ways that you can come in contact with students outside of those organizations. Youth who are members of friends or family, on social media, through radio club recruitment, professional organizations. But one of the biggest ways to commonly come directly in contact with youth are youth that are visiting your field day site. So it's very important to have youth materials at your field day site. One of the first problems with getting involved with youth is getting your foot in the door. Whether it's schools, homeschoolers, scouting, youth groups, community organizations, it's very important to get your foot in the door so you can start the process. And to do that, I think it's very important that you plan very carefully. You need to present a professional appearance in dress, actions, preparation, etc. You need to be aware that not everyone in your club is a good candidate for youth outreach or working with schools. Don't assume that existing club education programs, licensed instructors are always the best fit for youth outreach. That doesn't mean they can't be helpful, but it's very good to have someone who can make a good impression with schools when they go out to meet with them. Someone that understands education and educational philosophy and can speak the language of the educators when you're doing with schools, or if you're doing with organizations such as Scouts, someone who's familiar with that aspect of things. So it's a good idea to as I say, don't dress for a hamfest. Dress professionally for the appearance you want to make. The part of the approach to take with schools is something I would suggest is what can we do as hams to support activities in the school that you're already involved in? In other words, what can we do to help you with the mission that you're already trying to accomplish? Not look at all the great things we can do. Why aren't you doing this? You did this before, why not? So those confrontational type of approaches I think are very ineffective. So again, we want to try and blend in with what the school's already doing. One approach to this is piggybacking on the current high interest in STEM or STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics, and DIY, do-it-yourself movements in education. So I put together a piece of material for marketing. It's a trifold brochure that you can click on the link. By the way, there's links throughout this presentation. They are shown with this little icon that tells you it's a link. And when you click on this, it'll open that link up for you. We'll just open this one up. This is the trifold brochure that you can print out. It's a PDF. And it's called Ham Radio, the Original Maker Movement, and it has a bunch of resources. And this is a great handout that you can have at field day. This is something you provide to schools, etc. Also, there are brochures available from the ARRL. They are free, but just be aware that it takes a while to get them. So if you need to get some of these brochures from the ARRL, make sure you order them in plenty of time. Also, some are available to print directly from the website, so you can do that. Other ideas for getting your foot in the door with schools is the possibility to focus on space and satellites. The Aries group has educational content and educational videos that are available. A new project which is just being started is something called Youth on Satellite Activity, YOSA, with a focus on satellite privileges in the technician class license level, the use of low Earth orbit FM satellites, inexpensive radio equipment that many techs already have. So again, we're looking at focusing on the beginner's license, which would be the first one that youth could get, and having them be involved in a very scientifically oriented activity. So Youth on Science Activity. Look for more information on that coming up in the future. As far as scouting goes, Jamboree on the Air is one of the good opportunities to work with your local scouting group, whether it's Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, etc. And I have a number of links here on information on Jamboree on the Air. That usually occurs in the fall. Speaking of Boy Scouts of America, it's very important that you be aware of youth protection programs. The BSA, most public schools, and other groups require training or background checks for adult volunteers working with youth. The Boy Scouts of America has a free program that I suggest all volunteers take. You need to register first, but it's free to do. And I also have some other organizations that have free programs available. Youth protection is an issue that needs to be addressed by all hams working with any youth group, whether this is in a school, with a scouting group, at your home, at your club, your clubhouse for your radio club, whatever. It's very important that you follow the guidelines of the youth protection programs. In addition, check with your local schools or other groups for additional requirements. You may be required to do FBI or BCI checks to be able to work with youth in these locations. And always follow their guidelines. Here's some additional resources for youth protection training programs. Let's talk a little bit about demonstrating amateur radio for youth, or demonstrating amateur radio actually for anyone. The first examples is Radio Day, and this is a program I put together a few years back for 5th to 8th grade students, and I'll go into more detail on a future slide. Scouting events can be merit badge classes or different events of that nature. And then community activities. You can do a demonstration at your field day site, county fairs, other community events. Check with your local library to see if they run programs. And these are all great places to be able to reach out and demonstrate your amateur radio. So this slide talks about amateur Student Radio Day. And I have two handouts for this, and you can click on the links to get them. I'm going to go ahead and click on this link here. And this is the handout for the students that we typically give out. And this might be handed out on paper, or which is much more common now. I provide this to the teachers. They then upload it to the students' Google Classroom or shared folder so that they have all this information available electronically. They don't lose the paper. They can click on the links directly in here and access these resources. So these are a number of resources I have available. We also have the phonetic alphabet. We have a little chart here for doing Morse code. Now this isn't the way I suggest you do Morse code when you want to learn to get your license and communicate in there. This is just for quick demonstration purposes where someone can sit there and decode Morse code by listening to the dots and dits that are there. A little diagram on radio block diagram, so if I want to explain how radios work. Page on radio frequencies, what's on different bands, the AM broadcast band, shortwave radio, garage door openers, baby monitors, cell phones, just so some information on the frequencies. The metric prefixes for the different kilo, mega, giga, and tera. Section on wavelength and frequency. Diagram of the electromagnetic spectrum, and then a diagram of the amateur radio allocations. So again, the kids get this as a handout. For the teachers, I have a planning document on Radio Day. First of all, a description of what we're going to be doing, what type of volunteers are available, equipment that we might be using, and then a list of topics for the day. And I always have more topics than we're possibly going to be able to cover in one day because I want to let the teachers choose which topics they want me to focus on with their group. So for example, there are topics in all the subject areas. We're going to talk about radio through the eyes of all the different subjects. You notice again, the focus is on what is already happening in the school, and then we put the radio touches on top of that. So for example, with math, we have lessons available to do inversely proportional ratios or fractions for calculating wavelength and frequency. We might talk about metric prefixes. We could talk about exponents. So these are all math type of lessons we can tie into radio. Science, we have a wide variety. The electromagnetic spectrum, how radios work, how radio propagation works, space and satellites, orbits tracking, Doppler shift phenomena. So we let the teachers pick what type of topics they want to cover. And depending on the class and the teachers, sometimes I will be doing all the training, or sometimes the teachers will just want the background material and they'll do the training. So it just varies depending on the teachers you're working with. For social studies, we do polar and other map projections, and we can also do countries and cultures, governments and international regulations, historical relationships between countries, geographic facts. For language arts, phonetic alphabet, Q symbols, broadcast and radio and speech, and we could even do something on commercial radio with doing a radio drama with script writing. For music, frequency and pitch, we can discuss those. Morse code with drums, we use a high-low note to send different characters. Doppler shift and data rates, compression, digital audio processing are all great subjects for the older students. In art, we might give them a fake call sign and ask them to design a QSL card with information based on that location, what country that's in, and give them some little cute name that they put on the card and do that sort of thing. For world languages, foreign languages, universal communication across languages, the Q symbols, role of radio in world cultures, listening to native speakers and languages via radio broadcast, physical ed, demonstration of wavelength and frequency with jump ropes, and a whole variety of topics for technology-based activities. So again, this is just a starter. You can develop a lot more different curriculum-specific materials for each of the different areas. So back to our slide here. This again, as I said, is the Radio Day slide. And this is a picture of myself doing a radio day demonstration. And we started off with just a little what is amateur radio talk, a little slideshow that I gave them. And then we went into the different subject areas. In addition, we also did hands-on activities. We did a couple hands-on activities and some demonstrations. Before radio day ever takes place, I provide resources to the teacher so they can share them with the students. So I have some online resources here that you're welcome to utilize for that purpose. One of the activities is I usually do this with a class of with a whole grade level, so there might be 75 kids or more in a group. And even though we have them broken down into specific subjects and demonstrations, sometimes we need activities that they can do hands-on their own. So one of the activities is utilizing software-defined radios, online tunable radios that you can find out there. And I have a whole presentation on it and a whole handout here. And by using these software-defined radio, I clicked on the wrong one. Sorry about that. By clicking on the I'll have to fix that link. So there's a whole information sheet that would be given to the students on what these software-defined radio tuners are, and instructions on how to tune the radios, both the Kiwi and the SDR on lines, information on finding stations, and then frequencies for them to listen on to hear amateurs. So the whole idea using these is very easy because they can be used on existing computers in the school, Chromebooks, tablets, or even phones. So this is something that you can send the students home with as a take-home activity, or you can have them doing it at school. Another activity we sometimes do is we build Morse code keys out of clothespins, thumbtacks, a computer buzzer, and a 9-volt battery. So we put these kits together for less than $2 a piece by buying things in bulk. The most expensive item is the battery. And then we can have the students sending Morse code or demonstrating it. Sometimes we do them with all the students, or sometimes we just have a few to build as a group project. Plan your radio demonstration, your radio operations. One of the big parts of Radio Day is, of course, us demonstrating amateur radio. And we need to figure out what's going to be impressive to the kids and what can we do. And anyone can talk around the world with a simple cell phone, so sometimes the lure of just talking on the radio is not that exciting. You need to make it more exciting. One way to add excitement to anything is by adding a visual aspect to it. So if I'm making contacts, no matter what mode I'm using, I like to use visual displays such as a DX cluster display to show what stations are out there, visual maps of propagation, and different types of ways to trace it. So adding a visual aspect to it. If you're doing Morse code, a lot of radios have the ability to decode Morse code on the radio, but of course if you have a group of 30 or 40 kids, it's impossible to see this tiny little display. With the Kenwood TS590SG, there's actually a free piece of software available from Kenwood that allows you to display this on a computer, and that can be projected onto a screen. I always like to have maps with the prefixes for the various countries we might hear and allocations for what frequencies we're using. Bring in QSL cards and other things that you can show them visually. So again, keep your display visual. When you're considering what modes you want to use, there's really 4 different modes that you can consider, and you might be, if you have time, you could do all of them, but just some of the pluses and minuses. Phone, of course, is very easy to set up and for the students to understand what's being said, but as I said before, it may not be that exciting. CW, on the other hand, of course, would be very difficult for them to understand what is being said. But by using a visual decoder such as the one we showed earlier, and teaching them the sound of a few simple things such as your call sign, the CQ, Roger Roger, and a 73, you could have the students listening while you respond to someone that's calling CW and ask them to listen to see if they hear your call sign coming back. Again, visual displays of CW can be very helpful also. And I have a whole presentation on Morse code in all different aspects, not just for demonstration purposes, but all different aspects, and that's available at tiny.cc, Fun with Morse Code. Again, a little bit more about CW. Kids find it interesting that it's sort of a secret code, and the clothespin key, which we already discussed. There's also plans for something called a thumb texting key, which they might be very familiar with from using their thumbs to text with. So those are some things you may want to consider. Digital modes can be very helpful in that you don't have to speak with them, and there's a lot of visual aspect to them. So they're used to texting, and things such as RTTY or PSK would be very similar to what would happen with texting. And things like FT8 and FT4 with a visual display can be very interesting. If you are using things like that, use of displays such as PSK Reporter can show where your signal is being heard in the world. So even if you're not making two-way contacts, you'll be able to tell where your signal is being heard, and that's a nice visual thing to share. Satellite contacts. I have a whole bunch of resources here on getting started with FM satellites, tracking satellites, space exploration. One of the nice things about satellites is once you track where the satellite's going to be at, you know what time it's going to be there. So unlike propagation on the bands, you know that you'll probably be able to hear the satellite. I don't ever tell the students I'm sure we're going to make a contact, but I usually am pretty sure that we're going to be able to hear a signal at least coming down. So that's one of the things that could be positive about that. The whole idea of competition and the gaming aspect of amateur radio, if you have an opportunity to do your demonstration on a weekend when there's a contest going on, or one of the contests that occur during the week, it's a great way if you can include the use of the visual online contest scoreboards, the real-time scoreboards. And I wrote a whole article on gamification in amateur radio, so you might want to bring that into your resources. It's very important if you want to have good quality contacts is to do some planning. So the first thing I suggest is visual aid. So I always have a chart of the phonetic alphabet on the wall in front of the radio so that the kids who might be speaking on the radio would know what the phonetic alphabet was. I also have the students practice writing down their own name in phonetic alphabet so that when someone asks them what their name is, they can spell it to them phonetically. It's very important that you find a good station on the other side to carry on a two-way conversation, someone with a strong, clear, readable signal. And pre-planned schedules are a great way to have a station available. Don't worry about it. One option is to have a backup or planned station, someone you know who's going to be available on a band you know you can make contact on. They will have good propagation to the site. They will know that you're doing a demonstration with youth, and pick someone who can talk well with youth, can relate to them, knows what types of questions to ask and answer. And it's a great way to make the conversation more interesting. Ask good questions, have patience, minimize the amateur radio abbreviations and jargon when you're speaking so that they understand what you're saying, and have relatable questions and information for youth. Avoid radio talk of equipment, antennas, etc. They'll probably find that pretty boring. Whenever you're planning on-air activities, it's important to have a plan B, both alternative plans for on-air activities and off-air activities in case you could not complete whatever you want to do on-air. So let's say you set up a portable station, you have problems. Make sure you have backup equipment available. Have multiple bands available in case there's a problem making contacts on one band. Have other modes available. I remember one time I had a very big demonstration I was doing, got everything set up, got ready to make a 40-meter phone contact, and there had been a sunspot activity flare, and there was no propagation at all. Fortunately, I was able to use FT8 to squeak out a two-way contact with someone, and the kids thought that was great that we made a contact. They didn't realize that my original goal was a phone contact. Instead, I was able to relate. I was able to fall back and use the computer I had with me to make an FT8 contact. So have multiple plans available. Alternative plans, you need to have things that the kids can do that are air active but are not on the air. So I think the SWR listening is a great activity. So they can listen to a wide variety of stations. They can tune on their own. It actually gives them a hands-on ability to do the listening, not just dependent on you tuning the radio. Fox hunts are a great way to have activities where the students can take a very active role. Of course, you don't need to be licensed to do fox hunting because you're doing receiving. So we quite often do this as a demonstration for schools. We'll plant a couple foxes around the school, outside if the weather's good, inside if the weather's not that great. And then we'll have these type of measuring tape antennas and FM or HT receivers and have the students go around and find the foxes. And we have multiple teams searching for the fox. So that's a great activity because it's both competitive and it's hands-on. Soldering. When we worked with the local kids club in our junior high, one of our junior highs, and asked them what was the most interesting activities they did all year, fox hunting came in number one, but soldering came in number two. They enjoyed putting together small projects. We bought dozens of these projects on eBay for 99 cents to $2 each for small soldering projects that they'd have available. And we also brought in junk electronics so they could desolder components and work with those. So just remember to have a safety lecture and adult supervision available. But it was a great activity, and we were able to bring in some of our other club members who didn't enjoy the teaching aspect of working with youth, but they enjoyed the hands-on activity of demonstrating soldering. Robotics are another area that you can tie into amateur radio, and drones and balloon launches are a couple other things that can involve amateur radio. Videos. I have a grandson who's 10 and he loves watching YouTube videos about crazy things, but he also enjoys almost any YouTube video. So by picking out a set of YouTube videos on amateur radio that are suitable for kids, it's a great activity that you can have the kids share. And again, something you can send home with them to do after your visit. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about follow-up and some goals and some other things. So not all students or scouts will find amateur radio interesting enough to pursue further, but hopefully you'll have a few that might be very interested. Make sure that any youth that are interested are aware of how to continue into amateur radio. Make sure that you provide links and resources for them. Plan future visits. If things go really well at one school building, ask about doing additional school buildings or grades in the same district. I like to set up an annual type thing where the schools know I'm going to be available, and we set up a yearly schedule that we're going to come out for radio day and do it once a year with all the fifth grades, for example, in the school district. Provide physical resources. Think about donating some books to their school library, both technical and fictional titles that involve radio. Donate used books and amateur radio magazines to interesting teachers to share with students in their classes. I provide links available to the ICOM comic books, the Zach and Max series, both the color versions that they can read as PDFs, or also the black and white versions, which are the coloring book versions. So we make these available to the students, and because they're electronic and available as PDFs, they're available to all the students for no cost. Excuse me. So let's talk about some goals of your youth outreach. It's very hard to judge the success of your efforts in youth and amateur radio, as there are many unknowns and future potential for amateur radio interest or activities. You don't know if you're going to interest a student today that may get their license 10 years later. So it's hard to judge your outcome. Some goals to consider: a positive exposure of younger students to amateur radio, contribution to the education of youth. Remember, it's not just what they can do for you, what you can do for the school to help them in education process. Development of relationships with schools or youth groups, especially continued relationships where you work with them on an annual basis. Develop community capital, positive press, etc. can always be good for your amateur radio group in a whole. And spotlighting some of your activities with youth to local newspapers can be very positive. And if you do start getting new students, you may also start getting family members of those students involved in your club. So you may increase your club membership. Your goals may vary depending on the age of the youth involved. One of the real common things is people say, well, I want to go out and license X number of students, and that would be a good indicator that our youth program is very successful. And I think even though licensing of youth is one possible indicator, I suggest that long-term involvement is more important than one-time test passing. If your goal is active hams, not just licensing, mentoring is extremely important. So it's not just a matter of getting students to get their license, but it's to get them on the air and get them to be lifelong amateur radio operators. And the biggest key to that is mentoring and elmering. You need to get the new licensees on the air, provide a wide variety of potential on the air activities for tech class licensees, because that's what your new students are going to be, technicians. So I have a whole presentation on technicians' life beyond FM repeaters that you can use as ideas for working with those students with technician class licenses, so that they're not just limited to just FM, repeater, and simplex contacts. Help provide access to equipment, either with a club station that students can use, loaner equipment. We have some HTs that we can loan out to students who've just gotten their tech class license. And I put together a slideshow on buying amateur radio transceivers for our general and technician class licensee classes, but it would be good for youth also. Provide opportunities for joint on-the-air activities, including contesting, field day, public service events, etc. Invite those newly licensed students to work with your local club on all the activities your club would normally do. That's a great way to get them involved in amateur radio more deeply. Welcome them into the larger ham radio community. I suggest, if your club doesn't already do it, provide free membership to your club for any ham 18 years of age or under. And that's a great way to try and bring them in. And hopefully you might also get some of their other family members interested. Continuing educational opportunities are very important. General class licensing classes, non-on-air activities, antenna building and installations, how to work with coax, power, and other cabling, kit building and construction, using software to do logging, QSLing, awards, etc. So there's a lot of activities that are out there in addition to on-air activities that you need to spend some time elmering and mentoring. What else can you do? As the Ohio ARRL Section Youth Coordinator, I'm happy to work with you or your club if you're in Ohio, and I'll tell you what to do if you're not in Ohio in a second. You can also see my collection of articles on educational resources from the Ohio Section Journal articles by clicking on this link, and I try to put all my articles there so you can see them. If you're not in Ohio, check with your ARRL Section's Youth Coordinator, SYC, for assistance, and there's a listing available on the ARRL website. If your section does not have an SYC listed, contact your section manager and tell them that you need one. So the presentation today is available at tiny.cc/YIAR, and you can get access to all the resources there. If you need a PDF of the presentation, you can click on this link on the side here, and that will give you the resources. Please feel free to contact me at my email address, k8zt@arrl.net, and visit my website at www.k8zt.com. On that site, you will find a section for students and teachers. You'll find ham radio resources. You'll find the Kids Radio Zone, which is a web page for students with a wide variety of links. Another one for teachers on the Teachers Resource Zone page. And these are all available on my website, k8zt.com. So again, under students and teachers, there's also a section for ham radio resources with a list of some of the resources I talked about today, and some other resources that you can use as handouts for your field day or other activities. A section on what is amateur radio, slide presentation for using in schools, and other resources. So again, those are available at k8zt.com. And then I also have another page with at tiny.cc/k8zt-p that has all the different presentations I've been doing over the last 11 months this year. And there's a wide variety of both slideshows and videos available. And if your club is interested in the presentation of any of those for your club, just please contact me and I'd be happy to do that. So again, we'll go to questions and answer. And again, the link to all the resources is at tiny.cc/YIAR. So I will now take a breath, and we will see if we have any Q&A and anything in the chat. So I'm Melissa, go ahead, and if you have anything, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
I have one in the Q&A. Given
Okay.
that Hamcation has given its Educator Award this year to Neil Rapp and in the past to Carol Perry, who have been successful at the high school level, and Neil's school club has won the SCR many years, and he has personally mentored over 30 youngsters into the hobby, would you like to rethink your early statement that high school may be the worst place to approach kids?
I want to. Let me rephrase that a little bit. I think high school is the worst place to start the process. High school is a great place to continue the process, and I didn't mean to infer that high school was not a good place to do that. It's high school. It's much better if you can get to the kids before high school and begin the exposure. That will help grow your students in each level. And actually, with a local school district, we've worked, the routine we do is fifth grade, we go out to each of the elementaries in the spring and do radio day to introduce them to amateur radio. And we let them know that when they get to the sixth, seventh, and eighth grade building, there's an amateur radio club there for them if they want to join it. So we do that recruitment even before they get to the junior high. When they get to junior high, they can continue with the junior high club, and then they can move on to a high school club after that. So high school is a very good place to nurture amateur radio, but it's not the best place to start. So let me just rephrase that and say, even though if that's where you have to start, that's fine. But I think it's better to start before high school.
I don't have any more questions, but I have some comments that it was
Yes.
a very good presentation and that pointing out that girls are interested in the hobby.
Yes,
Girl Scouts.
yes, we find that in our school club that there's almost half and half. It's not just boys by any means, and some of our best operators are girls. So it's a great activity for any student, no matter gender or age. And again, please feel free to ask questions by clicking on the Q&A or on the chat. Well, what I'm going to do in the meantime is I'm going to show a little bit more of the resources that are available on the web page. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And then just a reminder that all the resources are available at tiny.cc/YIAR. Again, this is the KZT website, and the student and teacher portion is right in here. This handout is a very good one to use for field day or for other activities where you're going to be doing demos. It's designed so that you don't have to hand out the paper material. You can laminate this, put it available, and then the students can simply shoot the QR codes with their phone, or the parents can shoot them with their phone, and that'll give them access to any of the resources that are there. So it's a great handout for your public information table at field day or other places.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
How do you describe to a ham a young person, or how do you describe a ham to a young person who doesn't know ham radio? How do you describe what hams do this for fun?
Well, I think one of the biggest things to do is give them some examples of the fun things that amateur radio operators do as far as communicating. I also have a slide presentation available on the history of radio that approaches it more from that aspect. But I think the most important thing is the focus on the whole idea of there's multiple ways to communicate, multiple ways to experiment, and I think the thing to focus on a lot when you're explaining it is it's just like getting involved with other hobbies. You start off by learning the basics, and then you become more proficient, and you can enjoy things as you go along. So there's not just one thing to explain. Also, I like to explain that there's so many activities out there that once you learn one activity, you can move on to another one. So there's not just one thing to do. And one of the biggest things I explained the difference between what amateur radio is the fact that it's a two-way communication. Most kids understand commercial radio and how you can listen to commercial radio, but you can't talk back or you can't communicate with the people directly. So I like to talk about the fact that in amateur radio, we get to talk on the radio also. And then in addition to the difference between us and commercial radio, we get to pick the frequency and the mode we want to use, the type of communication, whether it's going to be voice or Morse code or a communication through a satellite. So we have a wide variety of different, what I'll call channels of communication available to us.
There's another question. How many hams are involved on-site to present for your radio day?
Yes. It varies. Sometimes I've done it by myself. Many times I've done it by myself. Sometimes I've had 2 or 3 other hams with me to help. And depending on the school, as I said, sometimes when I work with the teachers ahead of time, they say, well, they'd be happy to teach the lessons. So in some cases, I'm teaching all the lessons and doing all the demos. In other cases, I'm just doing the demonstrations and the hands-on activities. And in other cases, we have multiple people doing it. So the more you can have, the better. So yeah, it's definitely good if you could have more than one person, because I usually work with groups of about 60 to 75 kids at a time. So we usually pull all the students that are in a specific grade together at one time. I'm going to stop my sharing here. Pull them together from one grade. So that's always helpful to have more than one person. And I'll read the next question. What can one person do in a rural area with no club affiliation other than the ARRL to contribute to getting more hams on the air? Well, you can work with your local schools. You don't need to necessarily be in a club to do this. It's an activity I started on my own without the assistance of a club. One of the things about a rural area a lot of times is a lot of schools and other organizations are really looking for programs or resources that can add to the education of youth involved. So in a rural area, you can really serve a lot of needs that are not being met by other sources. A lot of times, students in a more urban area will have access to a science museum and other resources like that may not be available in the rural area. So by providing these type of talks to the local schools, on maybe your local library, your scouting groups, things like that, you're providing an invaluable service. So don't underrate the fact that you're only one person in a rural area. You can be a great resource. Here's a question. Anthony, how do you describe... Oh, okay, that's one I answered already. Middle school students, number 1, fox hunting, number 2, soldering. That was definitely the case that we found. Someone provided a link here to the ARRL Girl Scout radio patch. And again, that's on my website. I have a whole presentation available on the website on scouting in amateur radio, in addition to the session I did today. And as I said earlier, when you go to this link, let me just go back to share it again here. When you go to this link for tiny.cc YIAR, you're going to get another slide presentation that looks very similar to the one you're in. But this slide presentation has over 100 and, let's see how many slides are in here now, over 130 slides in it. So there's a lot more resources than we had time to go through today. So again, you want to make sure you go to that. There's homework from this session. Go to tiny.cc/YIAR.
There's a question in
yes.
the question answer.
For YouTube videos, what specific topic do you think would be interesting for unlicensed kids? Well, I put together a presentation. Let me just bring it up here real quick. It's at tiny.cc/100 radio. And it is something I actually started with my local radio club for a Christmas party, because we always do something different at our Christmas party that's not really just specifically oriented towards licensed hams, because there's usually spouses and other family members there. But what it is it's a history of the pioneers of radio, some YouTube videos on different aspects of the invention of radio and the radio science, and the different people involved. So each of these different people that we talk about has videos available in here that students can go through. And I'm going through it pretty fast here, but you can go through this. And it talks about the different history of radio, talks about commercial radio, talks about amateur operators, talks about military use. KDKA was just celebrated its 100th anniversary this last year. And the whole idea is this is a bunch of resources on different radio programs, etc. So again, that link to that is tiny.cc/100radio. In addition, as far as activities for unlicensed students, fox hunting is a great thing to try out. There's a whole set of videos, also YouTube videos done by the I'm gonna forget their name now. Family of youngsters in Florida. I think they're in Florida. I'm not sure. Leah and Hope. There's a link in the full slide presentation for that. But they have some videos, so there's a wide variety of videos out there. Okay, we're almost out of time. Do we have any last questions? Anthony, okay, that's one I already did. Just want to make sure there's nothing I missed here.
And there's nothing in the Q&A.
Very good. Okay. Well, again, the link is tiny.cc/YIAR, Youth and Amateur Radio. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. And again, please feel free to contact me at k8zt@awrl.net for any questions or comments that you might have, or if you'd like to have a program for your local club.